Consequences by Jason Lee. In this module, we will be covering reinforcement, punishment, schedules of reinforcement, and extinction. First, let's review a little bit from previous modules. This is the three-term contingency. Antecedent events come before behavior. SDs signal that reinforcement or punishment is available. Motivating operations alter the value of those consequences. The behavior occurs to get access to those consequences. Lastly, the presence of reinforcement or punishment increases or decreases the future occurrence of that behavior. A consequence is a change in the environment that takes place soon after the behavior occurs and alters the future probability of that behavior. Generally speaking, there are two types of consequences: reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement occurs when the future probability of that behavior increases or remains the same. Punishment is the opposite, in that when that occurs, the future frequency of behavior is less likely to occur. Consequences are the mechanism behind learning. Whether that is socially appropriate behavior or problem behavior, it is the consequences that maintain it. Understanding that which truly is a consequence for behavior means that you understand what is causing behavior, and it allows you to be more effective in intervening on that behavior. Finally, most behavioral interventions are focused on addressing the consequences of behavior. Now we will discuss reinforcement. A reinforcer is any stimulus that follows a response that maintains or increases future responding. These reinforcers are what we primarily use to change an individual's behavior, but they are not universal. Each person has their own preferences and learning history, which influences what is reinforcing their behavior. Furthermore, what reinforces a person's behavior can actually be aversive to another person. Can you think of any examples where this might be true? An example is something like tomatoes. Some people find tomatoes delicious and very reinforcing, where other people hate the texture of tomatoes. Some people will happily engage in a behavior to earn time playing on video games. For them, video games could be a high-value reinforcer. Others don't really like playing video games and won't work to earn video game time. Reprimands is another example. Some people will engage in inappropriate behavior just because reprimands serve as a reinforcer. For others, this may not be true. The point is that we don't want to make assumptions on what we think is reinforcing, because reinforcer preferences are specific to individuals. Additionally, reinforcer preferences may change over time. At the very least, people's preferences will change. What is a reinforcer yesterday may not be a reinforcer today. This shouldn't really come as a surprise, as we already talked about how deprivation or satiation can change the value of a reinforcer. We must always be aware of this reality and adjust our interventions to meet these changing reinforcer preferences. Reinforcers can usually be broken up into two different groups. The first is what is called primary reinforcers. These tend to be common amongst all humans. The other type of reinforcement is called secondary reinforcement. These reinforcers acquire their reinforcement power by being paired and associated with primary reinforcers. A few examples that might help clarify this concept. For primary reinforcers, we usually think of things like food, shelter, water, and pleasurable stimulation. Looking at these, you can already tell that they serve as reinforcers for just about everybody. A few examples of secondary reinforcers include money, tokens, praise, and toys. Each one of these reinforcers was at one time paired with a primary reinforcer. Before that pairing, all of these secondary reinforcers are just neutral stimuli. One thing to note is that sometimes secondary reinforcers will be called conditioned reinforcers. Pairing is the process of presenting preferred or reinforcing stimuli with other neutral stimuli. By doing this over and over, the neutral stimuli will eventually become reinforcing. Essentially, this is done by giving both the known reinforcer as well as the neutral stimulus at the same time or concurrently, or within a short temporal proximity of one another. Before going on, spend a moment to try to come up with some reasons why you think you would want to do this, and when it would be a good idea to do so. There are a lot of reasons why we may want to use pairing. For example, if someone shows exclusive preference for edible items, we may want to work with the individual to make verbal praise reinforcing. This is important because if we rely only on one type of reinforcer, then there could be a high cost associated with it. It may not be healthy to consistently use food, and it may be more socially acceptable to use praise rather than edible reinforcement. The best times to use pairing are when you are first working with an individual at the beginning of the session, and just whenever you want to increase reinforcement repertoires. Maybe a specific toy that you usually use for reinforcement was getting old or worn out. It would be great if other toys were reinforcing, so you could essentially pair the new novel toy with the old one in order to achieve this. Here is a critical thinking question. Does the individual have to be aware of the contingency? In other words, do people need to know what is reinforcing their behavior, or can the behavior still be reinforced without them knowing why? Behavior is reinforced all the time, even if we are unaware of that reinforcing contingency. Because reinforcers are so important, we need to know how to identify potential reinforcers. The simplest method is just to observe. While you're observing, keep detailed notes on the consequences of certain behaviors. If tantruming results in a reprimand, write that down. If self-injurious behavior results in them not having to do their homework, definitely write that down. All of these consequences could serve as potential reinforcers. It can also be helpful to conduct brief interviews. These interviews may help you initially determine some possible reinforcers. Lastly, there are preference assessments. Preference assessments are structured and scientific ways of determining potential reinforcers. We won't spend too much time on that here, and that will definitely come up in future modules. If you paid close attention in the last slide, you may have noticed that we use the term potential reinforcers. Why do you think this is? The reason is that all of the previously described methods will give us an idea of a person's preferences for certain stimuli. This preference does not guarantee that it will be reinforcing. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as oftentimes a person's preferred item is also a reinforcing item. This is more of a word of caution. If you are trying to reinforce behavior and you are not getting results, look to what you are using as a reinforcer and maybe consider changing that before you change your entire intervention. That being said, there are ways to verify if something is a reinforcer. There are unsystematic ways as well as structured methods. Again, we will cover these methods in later modules, but for now, it is simply important for you to recognize that there are ways of determining what actually reinforces behavior. We do not need to rely on guesswork or assumptions. Here's another critical thinking question. How can you tell if a consequence functions as reinforcement? Only after the individual has contacted the consequence and that response occurs more frequently again. In other words, the only way to know if something is a reinforcer is if it increases that future behavior. The next step in understanding reinforcement is to understand the difference between positive and negative reinforcement. Let's start with positive. When we say positive reinforcement, we mean that a stimulus is added to the environment and that in turn increases the future likelihood of behavior. So the new thing here is that positive means that you are adding some stimulus to the environment. This can get a little confusing because oftentimes we view the word positive as meaning favorable. In behavior analysis, the use of positive consequences simply means that we are adding something to the environment. Here are a few examples. If you give someone a piece of candy for asking politely, then you are adding something to their environment, and that would be positive reinforcement. If a student answers a math question correctly, and you vocally say, "Good job," then you are adding a praise statement to their environment. Same is true if you add a reprimand, give a reward, or give a token. If you are adding something to the environment in order to increase behavior, you are using positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is removing a stimulus from the environment to increase the future occurrence of behavior. Normally, we think of negative as a bad thing or something that's aversive. All we care about here is that something is removed from the environment. For example, if someone is screaming in your ear, that might be very aversive. If you then ask them to leave and they cease screaming and go away, the aversive has been removed. In the future, when someone is screaming in your ear, you may be more likely to ask them to stop and go away. We will look at some more examples here in a moment. It is important to know that we can further break down negative reinforcement into escape and avoidance. Escape is when an aversive is currently present in the environment. In our previous example, the screaming in your ear was an aversive, and asking them to stop was a way to escape that ongoing aversive stimulus. Avoidance is when a particular aversive is not currently present, but you engage in a behavior to postpone or delay that aversive. So maybe you see the same person that was screaming in your ear before, and you ask them to go away before they start screaming in order to avoid that aversive stimulus. Here are some examples that are more common in the real world. If rain is hitting your head and you engage in umbrella opening behavior, the umbrella then blocks the rain and you escape from the aversive. If your parents are yelling at you, then you might apologize for whatever happened. If they stop yelling at you, then you've just escaped that aversive. On the other hand, if you turn on the light to avoid stubbing your toe, or clean your room to avoid getting in trouble, then you might engage in avoidance behavior. As you can probably imagine, many of our behaviors are maintained by negative reinforcement. Here is the first half of a simple diagram that summarizes what we've gone over so far. Reinforcement increases future behavior, as indicated by the upward arrow, and it can do this either positively by adding a stimulus to a person's environment, or negatively by removing a stimulus from someone's environment. Over the next slides, determine if positive or negative reinforcement is being used. Assume that in all cases the behavior of the named individual increases in the future. There may be other people involved in each scenario, but only focus on the behavior of whomever is named. Before we go on, here are a few final tips on using reinforcement. First, make sure you vary reinforcement. So instead of just saying good job, use phrases like way to go, nicely done, that's right, or whatever else you can think of. The reason being is that satiation may occur if you only use one praise statement. If you are using edible items, use small amounts of each edible item to make it last longer and avoid health concerns. For example, if you are using a peanut butter cup, don't use the entire peanut butter cup as a reinforcer. Use small pieces of that peanut butter cup. Remember the effect that MOs have on behavior and rotate the availability of certain items. It may be beneficial to artificially create a temporary state of deprivation in order to ensure that reinforcers hold their value. Use a timer for open-ended activities. Don't forget to be creative. Nothing will work for every situation and every environment. You will need to be creative in order to identify effective reinforcers. Remember that just because someone likes something, it does not mean that it will function as a reinforcer. One very important aspect of reinforcement is the temporal dimension. In short, reinforcement should be delivered as quickly after the behavior occurs as possible. We can use verbal or pictorial cues to systematically increase the amount of time between completion of the target behavior and reinforcement. But when an individual is acquiring a specific skill, we should be delivering reinforcement as soon as we can, based on the exhibition of that skill. Next, we will discuss punishment. To start off, punishment occurs naturally. Even if no one else is present, there are still naturally occurring aversives that punish behavior. For example, if you are cooking food and stop to answer a phone call, if you are not paying attention, after time that food may start to burn. The smoke might set off the fire alarm and the loud noise might be aversive to you. If that noise is an effective punisher, you will be less likely to answer your phone while cooking food in the future. In this example, no one is intentionally punishing your behaviors, but punishment occurs naturally. Punishment has a lot in common with reinforcement, at least on a conceptual level. For example, the more immediate a punisher is delivered, the more effective it is. If you're trying to punish a behavior a week after the behavior has occurred, you likely won't get very good results. Additionally, punishers are also specific to each individual, and we only know if something is a punisher based on its effect on behavior. That effect is that if it reduces problem behavior in the future, it is a punisher. However, there are some significant differences between reinforcement and punishment, which influences why we typically don't use punishment or try to avoid using punishment in our interventions. One significant issue with punishment is that it doesn't teach appropriate behavior. Even if we use punishment appropriately and responsibly, to an extent that problem behavior is significantly reduced, that doesn't teach an individual what they should do instead. Therefore, if you are going to use punishment procedures, it is highly recommended that they always be paired with reinforcement procedures. Furthermore, generally people don't like to get punished. This can sometimes lead to reactivity for the individual receiving the punishment. Lastly, you also run the risk of not having anything to use for punishment. For example, if you have been taking away TV time from your child contingent on them yelling or screaming at you, you might see a reduction in the yelling and screaming behavior. However, if you have already taken away the total possible time that the child can engage in TV watching, and the child still exhibits some yelling behaviors, you have just run out of punishers to adequately address that behavior. Positive punishment is similar to positive reinforcement. A stimulus is added to the environment, and the future frequency of that behavior is reduced. Positive still only means that something is being added to the environment. A few examples of adding punishers to the environment would include producing an electric shock following behavior, getting yelled at or reprimanded, or other sudden loud noises. These instances are only punishers if the future occurrence of behavior is reduced. In negative punishment, a stimulus is removed from the environment and the future occurrence of behavior is reduced. Negative still only means that something is being removed from the environment. A couple of examples for negative punishment would be losing money or access to preferred activities, as long as the future occurrence of problem behavior is decreased. Now that we've gone over punishment, here is the full diagram of what you've seen before. Once again, reinforcement increases the likelihood of future behavior, and it can do this either positively or negatively. Punishment decreases the likelihood of future behavior, and it can do this either positively or negatively. Take some time on the next few slides and try to come up with your own answers before moving on. Our next topic will cover the schedules of reinforcement. A schedule of reinforcement is comprised of rules or systems that tell us when and which responses will be reinforced. These rules can get very specific, but at times can just be guidelines. The easiest way to explain this is to provide a few examples of actual reinforcement schedules. First up is what is called continuous reinforcement, or CRF. The CRF involves providing reinforcement for every single correct response. So let's say the behavior we are observing is completing math problems, and we are using small candies as reinforcement. In this example, that would mean that every time they complete a math problem, we give them candy. It doesn't matter how fast they do the problems, only that they do them correctly. CRF is the basis for all other schedules that we will be looking at in this module. The next type of schedule we will discuss is called the intermittent schedule. For this, reinforcement is given for some but not all correct responses. Think of this as the slot machine schedule. You may pull the lever down and spin the wheel many times, but only sometimes are you reinforced for that behavior. We can break down intermittent schedules into two categories. Ratio schedules involve reinforcing a behavior based on the number of correct responses. So you may need to engage in 10 correct behaviors to get the reinforcement. Interval schedules are similar, but focused on time. Instead of needing a certain number of correct responses, I only need to engage in a specific single correct response after a certain amount of time has passed. If the interval is set to 5 minutes, then after 5 minutes have gone by, I will need to engage in the behavior to get reinforcement. Any correct behaviors before the 5 minutes would not get the reinforcement. We also may define whether the schedule is fixed or varied. A fixed schedule is a schedule where the same number of responses or duration of time must pass before the reinforcement is given. A varied schedule of reinforcement means that the number of responses or the duration of time that is needed to pass changes around a predetermined average. We will discuss these more in later slides. A fixed ratio schedule, abbreviated FR, is when reinforcement is delivered following a pre-specified number of correct responses. This method is great for strengthening behavior as it produces high rates of responding. One easy example of fixed ratios is a person working on an assembly line. They may get paid for every 10 parts that they make. They can work as fast or as slow as they want, but they will only get their reinforcement after the 10th part is made. To make things simple, this would be abbreviated as FR10. Your student is working on math problems. You decide to use an FR5 schedule of reinforcement. When would you reinforce the student's math problem completion behavior? The answer is once they correctly complete the 5th math problem. The next schedule we will discuss is the varied ratio schedule of reinforcement, abbreviated VR, where reinforcement is delivered based on a pre-specified average of responses. To do this, you will need to predetermine the average number of correct responses needed. If we have a VR3 schedule, that means that on average, every 3rd correct behavior is reinforced. Maybe we will deliver it on the 2nd response. We could possibly deliver reinforcement on the 4th correct response, but in all, it will average around the number 3. Because people have a difficult time knowing when that reinforcement might occur, this schedule produces rapid, steady responding and creates persistent and durable behavior. A few examples of these schedules include gambling, fishing, or looking for sales. For example, gambling, you never know how many times you will need to pull that lever to win a prize, but these machines are often based on some sort of VR schedule, so you will have to exhibit a number of responses before you get a payout. Your student is working on math problems. You have decided to use a VR5 schedule for reinforcement. When would you reinforce the student's math problem completion behavior? On average, you would reinforce every 5th correct math problem. In a fixed interval or FI reinforcement schedule, reinforcement is delivered following the first target response at the end of a set time period. So if we are at an FI 30 seconds, then the first correct response after 30 seconds pass is reinforced. That first correct response may occur a couple of seconds or even minutes after the end of the time period, and it doesn't matter. We will not provide reinforcement until we observe that correct behavior. A VR schedule produces slow to moderate rates of responding that increase over time. One example of this is schedule activities. For example, waiting at the bus stop. That waiting behavior will not be reinforced until the amount of time has passed and the next bus arrives. If buses are scheduled to come by every 10 minutes, then this would be an FI 10-minute schedule. Your student is working on math problems. You have decided to use an FI5 schedule of reinforcement. When will you reinforce your student's math problem completion behavior? You would reinforce the first correct response after the 5 minutes has elapsed. A variable interval schedule of reinforcement is when reinforcement is delivered following a correct response after an average time period has passed. For example, in a VI 30-second schedule, a reinforcer will be delivered after a correct response following the passage of an average of 30 seconds. which means that the first reinforcer might be delivered at 30 seconds, and then 15 seconds, or 25 seconds, or 45 seconds, and 35 seconds, and so on. One example of this could be checking your mail. You know that it may take between 2 and 5 days to receive a package, but it could be any variable amount of time between those two in order to get that package. So you may see yourself checking the mail frequently during that time period. Your student is working on math problems. You have decided to use a VI 5-minute schedule of reinforcement. When will you reinforce your student's math completion behavior? For the first correctly completed math problem after an average of 5 minutes have elapsed. Read the next few examples and try to come up with an answer on your own before moving on. Consider how and when to thin that schedule. Schedule thinning is when we increase the ratio or interval of the schedule. If we start with an FR5 schedule, for example, we might then want to increase that schedule after we get desired rates of the behavior up to an FR10 or FR15. This is also referred to as going from a dense schedule of reinforcement to a lean schedule of reinforcement. Before going on, why do you think we would want this? One of the big reasons is to transition students to a more natural schedule of reinforcement or to create more persistent behavior. It is important to note that we never want to thin out a schedule too quickly. If we do thin the schedule too quickly, that may cause what is called ratio strain and can produce avoidance, problem behavior, and lapses in responding. Essentially, we want to thin the schedules as much as possible, but at a pace that won't cause ratio strain. We will discuss some methods used to avoid this in future modules. Our last major point of discussion is extinction. Extinction occurs when behavior was previously reinforced but no longer is. When reinforcement stops, the behavior will decrease. While this naturally occurs to everybody's behavior, if we want to decrease behavior without introducing an aversive element, then whatever reinforcer is currently maintaining a given behavior should simply stop being provided. By withholding reinforcement, behavior will be put on extinction and will decrease over time. Here is an example of a behavior that is naturally extinguished. Every morning, Jim stops at the water fountain outside his office to get a drink of water. One day, when he stops to get a drink, the water fountain does not dispense any water. The consequence for Jim in this example is that he gets to drink water when he stops at the water fountain and pushes the button. Extinction occurs when the water fountain stops dispensing water. Over time, Jim will learn that he cannot obtain water from stopping at the fountain, and therefore his behavior of stopping at the water fountain will decrease. Take a look at this example and see if you can answer the question before moving on. Before we can design an intervention that includes extinction, we must know the reinforcers that maintain the behavior. We will talk about the functions of behavior in another module, so for now, just remember that we do not recommend using extinction if you do not have an idea of what is maintaining the problem behavior. Here are some things to consider when you are using extinction to address behaviors that are maintained by positive reinforcement. Take a few minutes to review the information on this and the next slide. If you are having trouble with any of these concepts, please review the slides that were presented earlier in this module. Over the next few slides, please take a moment to read the situation. Try to come up with your own answer before moving on. part of the ABCs of behavior is manipulated. In other words, does an extinction-based intervention focus on the antecedent, behavior, or consequence? Extinction can be very effective at reducing some behaviors. The problem with this is that it does not teach individuals what they should do to get that desired consequence. For example, if a student disrupts the class in order to leave the room and go to the bathroom, we could just place this disruptive behavior on extinction. However, doing so would not teach the student an appropriate way to ask to go to the bathroom. Once again, the information in this module is intended to introduce you to these concepts, so it will be covered in detail later on. But it is important to know that we will rarely use extinction alone as our intervention. We often combine it with other teaching strategies to develop more appropriate responses in students.